In a dramatic intensification of hemispheric geopolitical tension, Iran has issued a sharp warning to the United States amid Washington's rapidly expanding military posture in Latin America and the Caribbean. The confrontation emanates from the US administration's recent moves to treat drug trafficking networks as terrorist threats and to deploy naval, air, and possibly ground force assets to counter them, with Venezuela at the center of the unfolding drama. At a regular briefing in Tehran, Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson Esmail Baqai delivered what is being described as a direct challenge to President Donald Trump's Latin American strategy. These international norms are being breached in various parts of the world, including Latin America, under the pretext of drug trafficking, Baqai declared, invoking the language of sovereignty and international law. His remarks followed a stunt of sorts, the US military publicly striking vessels in the Caribbean, which President Trump claims were ferrying narcotics to the United States. Baqai went on to say that Iranian forces remain on heightened alert as a matter not just of deterrence, but of foresight and wisdom, signaling that Tehran intends to monitor any US escalation, even if it takes place thousands of kilometers from the Persian Gulf. The implication is clear. Iran regards the US push into Latin America as potentially destabilizing and is positioning itself rhetorically in solidarity with Latin American states resisting US intervention. From Washington's perspective, the policy shift is dramatic. Whereas past US counter-narcotics efforts emphasized interdiction and law enforcement, this administration has recast powerful criminal organizations as terrorist threats and authorized strikes in international waters. A confidential notice to Congress, obtained by media outlets, describes a non-international armed conflict between the US and designated drug networks. The document refers to them as non-state armed groups and unlawful combatants, thereby giving the US military broader scope for lethal action. President Trump, speaking at the Japanese naval base at Yokosuka earlier this month, declared the United States was waging war like they've never seen before against criminal networks that traffic drugs across the hemisphere. That remark, made at a US Fleet Forward facility in Asia, underscored the global orientation of his administration's narcotics agenda. And in the Caribbean, the policy has produced visible consequences. On the 2nd of September, a missile strike sank a boat alleged to be transporting illicit drugs from Venezuela, killing 11 people. On 15th September, a second strike killed 3. So far, the administration has counted multiple vessels and dozens of casualties. The backdrop is a US naval buildup in the southern Caribbean since August. Destroyers, F-35 jets, even a nuclear-powered submarine have entered the region, ostensibly to choke maritime cocaine routes. One intelligence summary describes the enterprise as targeting the drug revenue lifeline of Venezuela's senior military leadership, though some analysts caution that the hardware on display exceeds what is necessary for traditional anti-drug operations. For Venezuela, this is existential. President Nicolas Maduro has accused the United States of staging a covert war under the guise of counter-narcotics. Caracas formally requested an emergency session of the United Nations Security Council, arguing that US strikes and overflights threaten its sovereignty and stability. Meanwhile, Iran's declaration underscores the diplomatic and strategic ripple effects of the confrontation. Tehran and Caracas have long maintained friendly ties. Iran's intervention in Latin America rhetoric adds another layer of complexity to Washington's hemisphere strategy. The Iranian Foreign Ministry statement frames the US advances as a violation of the core principles of the UN Charter and warns of broader consequences. Increased acts of lawlessness and aggressive unilateralism by Washington risk undermining peace and stability in the region. The statement emphasizes that Latin America must not become a zone of external military intervention wrapped in counter-narcotics rhetoric. But the US calculus is straightforward. The national security threat posed by synthetic opioids such as fentanyl and historic drug flows from Latin America into the United States have compelled the administration to adopt more aggressive tools. In its telling, these drug networks are not mere criminal enterprises. They wage war on US society by flooding American streets with lethal narcotics, and they enjoy safe havens in regions far from traditional battlefields. Yet the new posture has sparked legal and diplomatic pushback. Critics say the determination to treat non-state criminal organizations as insurgents opens a Pandora's box under international law. If the US is in a non-international armed conflict with drug trafficking networks, then where lies the boundary between law enforcement and warfighting? In Latin America, sovereign governments like Mexico and Colombia have expressed unease, wary of US kinetic operations inside or near their territory. The friction with Mexico is significant. President Claudia Sheinbaum warned plainly that with Mexico, it is collaboration and coordination, never subordination or interventionism, and even less invasion. In other words, she signaled that any US unilateral military incursion would run into resistance. In Ecuador, too, the designation of local gangs as foreign terrorist organizations by Washington drew concern about how far the counter-narcotics war may extend. Some analysts suggest Washington is building a hemispheric architecture of interdiction that blurs conventional geographic and legal lines. For Iran, the wider implication is strategic. By aligning rhetorically with Latin American states resisting US military maneuvers, Tehran positions itself as a global critic of US interventionism. It also raises the possibility that Iran may exploit this US hemispheric focus to deepen its own ambitions elsewhere or form new alliances in the region. Yet the stakes for the United States remain real. Hundreds of thousands of Americans die each year from opioid overdoses, and the authorities attribute a growing portion of those deaths to synthetic drugs sourced via Mexican routes or Caribbean maritime shipments. By elevating drug trafficking networks to the status of terror threats, the administration seeks to mobilize the full national security toolkit, surveillance, interdiction, targeted strikes, in a hemisphere it long considered peripheral to high-end military strategy. The fundamental question now is whether Washington's approach will deter the cartels and criminal networks, or whether it will provoke a regional backlash that undermines US partnerships and sovereignty norms. Will Latin America accept a US military footprint replacing traditional law enforcement cooperation? Will the designation of cartels as terrorists spur more international cooperation or more diplomatic rupture? At the same time, Iran's warning should not be dismissed as purely rhetorical. While Tehran has no boots on the ground in Latin America comparable to the US Navy, its diplomatic posture suggests it is willing to publicly challenge Washington's hemispheric assumptions. In doing so, Iran seeks to widen its influence by aligning with states Washington is pressing militarily. That signal may resonate not just in Caracas or Havana, but in capitals across the developing world, watching whether the US can respect sovereignty while pursuing global interdiction campaigns. Back in Washington, the administration faces congressional scrutiny. Lawmakers question whether the president's unilateral authority suffices to justify military strikes on vessels in international waters without a formal declaration of war. Legal scholars worry about the implications of detaining or killing suspects tied to drug networks when they are not part of an armed insurgency recognized under international humanitarian law. From the White House vantage point, the risk of failure is also real. A deep military engagement in Latin America could undermine US credibility and partnerships if it appears more like intervention than joint counter-narcotics cooperation. US allies in the region may balk at the shift, especially if civilian casualties mount or national sovereignty is perceived to be violated. And for Tehran, the moment provides a stage. By publicly rebuking US actions and aligning with Latin American notions of sovereignty and anti-imperialism, Iran crafts a narrative of global resistance to US power. Whether that translates into tangible influence in Latin America remains uncertain, but symbolically, it demonstrates that the US hemispheric sphere is no longer immune from external critique or contestation. In sum, this is more than a narcotics interdiction campaign. It is a convergence of counter-cartel policy, hemispheric power projection, international law questions, and global great power signaling. When Iran warns that US military moves in Latin America undermine peace and security, it is staking a bold diplomatic marker. When the US president promises war-scale operations against drug networks outside traditional theaters, it is signaling a new front in the war on drugs, one that reaches from the Caribbean to Tehran's vantage. The coming weeks will test whether this strategy holds or unravels. Will Latin American governments resist US pressure? Will sovereignty protections prevail? And will the region slip into a new zone of great power contestation? Already, the tectonic plates of the Western Hemisphere are shifting, and this time the war zone may well extend from the Gulf of Mexico to the Persian Gulf.